peace, hundreds of thousands throughout the country left war plants for the last time. Civilian goods like ironers are already trickling from factories, and shortly washing machines and other luxuries we've missed will be pouring from the factories at 1942 prices. And soon you'll be able to give that jalopy a well-earned rest. With gas again plentiful, and with new cars and new tires on the way, America will be rolling with a pre-war flourish. Yes, cars, radios, vacuum cleaners, nylons, juicy steaks. It sounds almost like a dream.
The year is 1945. The United States emerged from World War II stronger than ever, and the demand for our knowledge and technology changed diplomacy. In the post-war period, the size of U.S. embassies mushroomed. And for the first time, agricultural technicians, business and financial experts, military attachés, and advisors often outnumbered professional diplomats. This expansion of the U.S. diplomatic presence provided the additional resources the United States needed when it confronted a new threat from an old ally, the Soviet Union. During World War II, more than 20 million people had died in the Soviet Union. The Soviets were just as determined as the Americans never to let such a war happen again. But under Joseph Stalin,
the Soviet Union chose a very different path to ensure its security.
A path that brought it into direct confrontation with the United States.
Stalin believed that the Soviet Union would be safe only if it was surrounded by nations that shared its ideology.
After the war, he imposed communist governments on most of Eastern Europe.
When I went to Potsdam, I thought I could get along with Stalin. How mistaken I was. He made 32 agreements, and he broke every single one of them. What are you going to do with an outfit like that?
No one wanted another war, but the West was uncertain how else to stop the spread of communism. George Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow, provided the key. He argued that the United States had to be a leader and use diplomacy to firmly resist the Soviet challenge. This policy became known as containment, and President Harry Truman followed his advice.
I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
In 1947, the Truman Doctrine offered American assistance to any nation directly threatened by communism. And in 1948, the Marshall Plan set in motion a massive economic aid program to assist European countries devastated by World War II.
Tension gripped the world as the West and the Soviet Union waged a new kind of war, a Cold War. The Soviets made one of the first moves in this new war, in 1948, by blocking access to the divided city of Berlin. Rather than fight, the United States organized an airlift to bring in desperately needed supplies to the blockaded city. Known as the Berlin Airlift, this humanitarian operation lasted for over a year. To further discourage the Soviet Union, Secretary of State Dean Acheson and 11 other Western foreign ministers established a defensive military alliance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in April 1949. Later that year, a new threat appeared when Mao Zedong's communist forces took control of China. To many Americans, it was shocking that China would go communist. Some, like Senator Joseph McCarthy, blamed American diplomats for losing China. McCarthy claimed that he knew the names of 205 communists who worked at the Department of State. Although nothing was ever proven, the careers of many in the department were destroyed at a time when expertise on Asia became critical. In June 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea, and the U.S. took the issue to the United Nations. 21 countries sent supplies, medical personnel, or combat units to South Korea. After 3 years of bitter fighting, diplomats arranged a ceasefire, with no gains for either side. While fighting ended, peace was never officially declared. Today, North Korea and South Korea remain separated by a demilitarized zone. During the 1950s, diplomats played a key role in our national security by building military alliances with countries that opposed communism. In 1952, the existing Rio Pact and NATO were joined by the ANZUS Pact. The circle was completed in 1955 with the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization and the Central Treaty Organization. That same year, the Soviet Union countered with its own defensive alliance with the nations of Eastern Europe called the Warsaw Pact. Meanwhile, a new and different front was operating in the Cold War, a diplomatic front that focused on public opinion and the prestige of the United States. Dozens of new nations emerged in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East as former European colonies won their independence during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
Decolonization provided an opportunity for both the United States and the Soviet Union, which tried to gain these countries as allies. But these new nations felt squeezed by the two superpowers and were alarmed by the possibility of nuclear war. In response, they formed a non-aligned movement to address their common concerns and conduct international relations without interference by the superpowers.
In 1961, the leaders of these new countries met for the first time in Yugoslavia at the invitation of President Josip Tito. Eventually, more than 100 nations joined the movement. The Soviets and the Americans used the lure of new technology to gain these countries as allies, but the Soviets seemed to have the advantage. Under Nikita Khrushchev, they led the space race with the launch of Sputnik, the first space satellite, in 1957. Then, in 1962, the Cold War escalated. The Soviets ignored the Monroe Doctrine and began building missile bases in Fidel Castro's Cuba, just 90 miles from U.S. territory.
The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the two superpowers to the brink of nuclear war.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
During 13 tense days in October, President John F. Kennedy and his closest advisors engaged in direct personal diplomacy that ended crisis and avoided a nuclear war.
Under President Kennedy, the United States seemed young, modern, and dynamic. A new kind of diplomat reinforced that image. American astronauts from John Glenn to the crew of Apollo 11 traveled the world as symbols of American technology. Along with popular entertainers who already toured the world, they brought American culture to millions. Satellites beamed news and entertainment from the United States around the world. In 1961, President Kennedy founded the Peace Corps. American volunteers went to live and work in underdeveloped countries to help them overcome poverty, disease, and illiteracy. Americans were optimistic and self-confident. But just a few years later, the war in Vietnam changed the way we looked at ourselves and the world.
Supported by very heavy artillery, B Company are now moving in on what's called a probe to the Long Bay Special Forces camp, which is now believed to be occupied by about a battalion North Vietnamese army.
Television beamed the horror of war into America's living rooms for the first time, and ordinary citizens found themselves caught up in the debate over the war and our foreign policy.
But in the bloody Civil War, yes, I even killed my brother, so many others, but I ain't a kid anymore.
The growing anti-war movement put intense pressure on both Presidents Johnson and Nixon to negotiate with the North Vietnamese and to put an end to U.S. involvement. In 1969, media attention surrounding the Paris peace talks on the conflict in Vietnam led President Nixon's National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger into secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese. Only a few people inside the White House had any idea that these talks were underway. These negotiations continued until January 1973, when we ended our involvement in the Vietnam War. At the same time, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger adopted a new diplomatic approach to the diplomacy towards China and the Soviet Union. This policy, known as détente, was intended to ease tensions Nixon and Kissinger signaled their willingness to open lines of communication with Communist China. When the Chinese decided to respond, they chose some surprising diplomats. In April 1971, the Chinese invited a U.S. ping-pong team to Beijing. Ping-pong diplomacy opened the door for secret visits to Beijing by Kissinger, paving the way for President Nixon's historic visit in February 1972.
Détente also played a major role in our relations with the Soviet Union. Diplomatic negotiations led to the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty in 1972, which limited the number of nuclear weapons on both sides.
During the 1970s and 80s, diplomacy was a high-profile business. Kissinger, who appointed President Nixon's Secretary of State in 1973, flew over 565,000 miles, making 213 visits to foreign countries.
In fact, the phrase shuttle diplomacy was coined to describe his frequent Mideast missions.
And President Nixon's highly visible face-to-face meetings with other world leaders became almost routine incidents in later. During this period, America also began to establish a unique role as a peacemaker. Jimmy Carter personally brokered the Egyptian-Israeli peace accord at Camp David in 1979.
In 1987, President Ronald Reagan reached an agreement with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons from Europe.
As fears of war faded, other problems confronted American diplomats. Problems such as human rights abuses, drug trafficking, terrorism, and world hunger forced diplomats to use different tactics. In the 1975 Helsinki Accords, diplomats linked human rights and security issues in the hope that this would lead to change in the Soviet Union. And congressional lobbyists, private charities, and even popular entertainers pressured the White House, the Department of State, and Congress in an attempt to influence foreign policy on various issues. Racial issues also entered the international diplomatic arena, as pressure grew during the 1970s and 80s to end the apartheid policies of the white government of South Africa. In 1986, public opinion led Congress to pass a strong anti-apartheid bill. Global public pressure contributed to the release of activist Nelson Mandela from a South African jail where he was held for more than 26 years. Meanwhile, the once powerful Soviet Union was in trouble. Severe economic problems forced President Gorbachev to embrace economic restructuring, or perestroika, and to follow a policy of glasnost, or openness. The Soviet Union could not afford to compete with the United States and could no longer control Eastern Europe or its own ethnic groups. In June 1987, President Reagan called on Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall. In 1989, the wall finally came down. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself broke apart, and the United States recognized the newly independent nations. Almost overnight, the Cold War was over. The end of the Cold